So my name is Jessica Leichtweisz. I'm a BCBA. Some of you guys know who I am, and some of you don't, which is fine. You will by the time you're done today. So I have been in the field of applied behavior analysis since 2008. I had fallen in love with this little boy that used to go in my church. I used to go to church and I was a Bible study teacher. And he used to always pray for chicken fingers and French fries and thank God for Pokemon. And I thought it was adorable. I had never heard of autism, but I got my first job as an EBA therapist back then. That was when BCBA was around, but really kind of wasn't a thing. So none of us thought it was going to be a thing. So I was working under a CIT license in New York for many, many years as a case manager before I relocated to Arizona and was forced to take this test. Fortunately, my schooling was just made it under the 4th edition. I had just enough time to do my supervision when I decided to move and knew I needed to become a BCBA. And I did sit and pass my exam last September. But in doing so, I realized how hard this stuff is and how much there are a lot of study materials out there, but a lot of them, in my opinion, are really overpriced and they just weren't taught in a way that made sense for me. You know, I really wanted someone to break things down and explain it to me, and I wasn't getting that. So I decided to put out my own study materials. And so that's where I am here helping you guys. Now, I don't know if you hear him or not. My dog's in the background. Sometimes Zoom filters him out. Sometimes he lets him in, but you'll probably hear him. His name is Lucky, and he's generally a part of us sitting together. So today we're going to talk about the really functional assessments. Now, there's some speculation that this was new material that was added on the 5th edition, and it's really not necessarily new material. There was more emphasis placed on the different forms of functional assessments. And there's been these rumors where we have to know about the types of functional assessments. And I honestly don't know if that's true or not. When Dr. Katie and I originally put out our 5th edition crash course, we didn't go into details on the different types of functional assessments. And I haven't seen the test. I don't usually ask people about the questions on the test. So I don't really know whether or not you're going to find that you're going to get questions on what the different types of functional assessments are. But I do think it's really good to know what they are, especially because some of this technology is very new. Dr. Iowata has an amazing video he made on this, and I can include that video when I send out the recording for this. I'll send that out as well with, in addition to this permanent product, just a link on YouTube of a video I like that he did. And there's a lot of practical applications of these functional assessments. So even if you don't need to know what they are, you will if you do. And if you don't need to know what they are for the exam, sometimes there's stuff we don't need to know for exam that I think we would benefit from knowing in practice. So I did some deep dive into the types of functional assessments, and we'll go over them today. So I do want to take this relatively from the beginning. You know, this is not super intensive. This is meant to be informational. So we're not going to go too far into this, but I want to make sure everyone here, before we talk about the types of functional assessments, in case you just started studying, what an FA is. So a functional assessment, right, is going to be a way that we're determining the function of a behavior. Now, this is interesting. I did cite this research, but there was a study that was done by these people down here in 2012 that found that functional assessments really only work well for children with disabilities and that they don't really have a practical application for typically developing children. So I thought that was a really interesting study. I didn't really know that, in all honesty, before I started doing the research to make this presentation. So I figured you guys might want to know that as well. So a functional assessment is essentially when we're going to be testing, right? So we have our functional behavior assessments, or FBAs, and those can be our indirect indirect assessments and our direct assessments, where we're either going to be talking to people to gather information and make a hypothesis, or collecting that ABC data, right? Either the narrative data or the descriptive data, where we're determining what the function is. Sometimes we actually really need to confirm and test our results. And when we're testing, we're going through a functional assessment. This is going to be where we're arbitrarily creating conditions for a behavior to occur, and then reinforcing that behavior if we can elicit with and we're literally reinforcing the maladaptive behavior that we want to elicit in order to then make sure that we are able to confirm I'm sorry, I'm getting thrown off because I'm trying to admit people in the chat into the Zoom as well. Then we're going to confirm what the function of the behavior is. So functional assessments, they're very time consuming, right? They're very time consuming. They take a lot of resources. They do require someone is trained on how to do it. They have a lot of risks. We're going to go over some of those risks today. So they're not done all the time. In practice, in all honesty, I've never actually done a functional assessment, and I've been serving in some capacity performing a and I don't want to say I've not been a BCBA for 14 years, but I've been in the field of ABA in case management for a very long part of that. And I've never actually done one in real life. But that's what the purpose of it is. So this is literally taken right from Cooper. I did cite it down here. I just copied and pasted this chart for you, just because honestly, I didn't have time to make it look pretty. So we have our conditions of an FA, right? So we have our play condition, our contingent attention condition, contingent escape condition, contingent tangible, and our alone condition. So when we're giving our play condition, that is our control, right? That's when we're going to be giving the child attention. We're going to be giving them, there's no demands on them, and they have everything that they want. So ideally in that situation, no behavior should occur unless it's an automatic behavior. So this is going to be our control condition where we're testing against other phases. Then we have our contingent attention condition, right? This is when we're going to deprive a child of attention, and we're then going to only reinforce the maladaptive behavior that is attention seeking. And that's going to give us confirmation that the child was actually engaging in attention seeking behavior. And again, I could teach hours on this, but I'm going to make this brief because I only have 30 minutes to get through all this stuff. Then we have our contingent escape, right? This is where we set up a situation where there's a demand on the child, and then if they engage in a maladaptive escape behavior, maybe they have a tantrum or they throw or kick or scream or push the materials off the table, we reinforce that behavior. And that's going to confirm for us if the behavior stops, they were actually doing it to escape. Tangible, it's the same thing. We have something they want. Maybe they want their iPad and we take it away, or their phone, we take it away. And then if they engage in maladaptive behavior, we give them it back. And then if they stop, we know that the behavior was to get that object. Then we have our alone condition. This is different than our play condition because in our play condition, it is a control, and they are being, the attention, and it's different than our attention condition because here we're not actually looking to see, we're not going to be giving them any attention if they're contingent on their behavior. This is to test for sensory function. So sometimes the alone condition and the contingent attention condition can be confusing because they seem similar because you're not providing attention. But in that alone condition, again, you're not going to have any materials there. So it's just the child is literally just alone in a room with nothing around. And you see if the behaviors occur as a way of the child, so to quote, entertaining themselves, right? Does the behavior occur with nothing? There's no play materials, there's no teacher, there's no therapist, there's just nothing in the room. And let's see what happens there. So that's going to be your alone condition. Right. So then when we're looking for, like I said, is that in one of these conditions, and usually with a full functional analysis, or sometimes it's called an expanded functional analysis, which is our traditional functional analysis, we're looking to see if one of these things happens more often than others. And again, this is the last thing I took directly from Cooper, but this is the chart here where we're looking, and I'm going to try to zoom in so you can see this more clearly. Right. And then we're looking here. Okay, so here we see that the behavior occurred. Sorry, let me get my right annotation tools. It occurred more frequently here, like in a contingent attention, than it did in any other phase. So we can know now this behavior was maintained by attention. Here we see that it happened more in escape than it did in any other condition. So we know, okay, it happened for escape. And let me clear this out and scroll down. We have our alone condition right here. So this, we know that it was an automatic function here. And then here, it's not differentiated, meaning that there is no one, the results are totally inconclusive, which tells us that either it's possibly an automatic function, or we just were not able to tell what the behavior was being caused by in that particular moment in time. All right, so generally speaking, and these numbers are of 95% accuracy, and there are some studies that are going to cite that later down below. But generally speaking, a functional analysis will work 95% of the time. So it's a really, really good, chance we're going to find the function of behavior, but 5 out of 10 times we're not going to find the function of behavior. And that's sometimes when we see that it's undifferentiated, which is just essentially the child didn't engage in the behavior. We know that it's like when you take your car to the mechanic and tell them that something's not working and then they make it work, right? That happened to me the other day. Literally, I went to the dealer for my car because my window would not roll down for like 3 weeks. And I finally brought it to the dealer and they clicked the button and it rolled down. And I was like, okay, I felt stupid, right? Sometimes kids just aren't going to do what we want them to do because we want them to do it. So that happens. So a functional assessment, it does have risks. Number one, it risks reinforcing behavior, right? Because we are reinforcing behavior in a functional analysis. So we're reinforcing a problem behavior. Anytime a behavior is reinforced, it means it's going to be likely to happen again. So we continuously are reinforcing a problem behavior that does run the risk of making the behavior happen more often, which obviously is a problem. So it's not ideal to be doing that. It also can evoke challenging behavior, right? That's just unpleasant. It's unpleasant for the parents. It's unpleasant for the child. It's unpleasant for the practitioner. So why would we want to make someone upset, right? So unless we really need to know this function, unless it's really critical, ethically, there's some ethical considerations about doing a functional analysis, because essentially we're going to be we're reinforcing problem behavior. We're evoking problem behavior, where we're making it happen, where you would think as ABA therapists, we want to avoid problem behavior, right? And then sometimes there's a risk that it could be unsafe. And that's if a child is headbanging, if a child's doing something dangerous, if the problem behavior is like a child picking their nose, okay, it's not that big of a deal. But if they're bashing their head on the floor and they're at risk of breaking their nose, then we need to be a little bit more careful. So like I said, there are different types of functional analyses, and those functional analyses, the different types of them, are meant to mitigate these risks. So we'll go through them. All right. So the types of them, of the different types of functional analyses, those are going to be your brief FA, your trial-based FA, your synthesized FA, your latency FA, and then your functional analysis of precursors. All right. So your risks, here we go. So we'll go through them all. So your brief FA. Your brief FA is typically used in schools and clinics when there's time constraints. So it's essentially just a traditional functional analysis done the exact same way, but they're shorter sessions. So typically you'll have like 3 to 5 sessions, and they'll last anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes with an expanded or typical FA. With a brief FA, you're going to conduct them exactly the same way, but it's going to be much shorter. You're only going to be doing 1 or 2 in each of the conditions sessions, and they'll be 5 to 10 minutes long. So it typically takes about half the amount of time, which just is better for time constraints. That's the only real problem that a brief FA solves, is time constraints. It doesn't solve any of the other problems about creating behaviors. I mean, I guess you can say you're reinforcing a behavior less because it's happening less, but it isn't going to solve that problem of evoking dangerous behaviors. Now it is, and I thought I had the study cited somewhere. If not, I will cite it before I send this out. Oh yeah, I think it's somewhere. I have to find the citation for it. It seems to be missing. But a brief FA is 50% of the time. And I will put the citation on YouTube because this is being recorded. So I know, just so you know, I will put all the citations in the comments. So this is about 50% of the time accurate. So it's not 100% accurate, but 50% of the time is still pretty good. It's much better than just kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mo, the function is attention, right? So, but considering we can about half the time get really good results from this is kind of what we should go to first, in my opinion. We're going to do a functional analysis. If we start here, we can always do an expanded FA if we need to. It's not like if we start with a brief FA, we can't continue. Yes, Belinda, are you asking about in this one, in the brief FA, you still do each condition more than once?
Yeah, is that what you're saying? You do each one? Okay.
Yeah, so you're typically going to do it like 1 or 2 times, and with an expanded FA, you're going to be doing it like 3 to 5 times. So you're going to be doing the brief FA 1 to 2 times, which is why I was saying if you don't get your results, you can start with a brief FA and then always do a full FA if you need to. All right, now we have our trial-based FAs. So this was actually relatively new, developed in 1995 by Sigafu, I guess that's his name, and Sagers. I probably butchered them, but this is this is actually, believe it or not, even more accurate than a than a brief FA. This is when you're using ongoing activities to test things in vivo, like in real life. So you have a session, you think, and you have two phases, your control phase and your test phase. So you think that a behavior, and you are going to still do all of the conditions. You basically will, you want to see whether or not a behavior is occurring because a child wants the phone. So you give them the phone, then you take it away. And then if the behavior occurs, then you mark it down as plus and you give it right back to them. So this is going to be where you're doing trials. And your trials are essentially where you're trying to evoke the problem behavior and then recording if you're successful. And you are going to still do that multiple times. You're going to do it 3 to 5 times for each one of the conditions. So 3 to 5 times, you're going to see if the kid is going to scream if they take away the iPad. You're going to put demands on the kid and see whether or not they're going to get upset. You're going to ignore the child and see whether or not they engage in an attention-seeking behavior. But the big difference here with your trial-based FA is there's not really condition. It's not like test phase conditions. It just happens really, really fast. So for like your brief FA and for your traditional FA, there's like phases. So you're going to have in your brief FA, it's going to be 5 to 10 minutes, but it's going to be 15 to 20 minutes, and that's where any behavior in that 15 to 20 minutes is going to be reinforced. Whereas a trial-based FA, it just mixes up very quickly. So there's no real ever condition. It just happens in the moment. So this is actually a pretty effective way of doing things. I think that in real life, we probably do this a lot more than we realize, and probably very informally. I think this is one of the coolest new kind of technologies. And I really hope that this will replace a traditional FA in most clinical settings. This is 60 to 80% as accurate, which is really good. I mean, it's only 95% accurate, 95% accurate for an FA. So 80%, considering how much less resources this takes, how less traumatic it is for the child, how much less risk there is, I think this is actually a much better option. So I really do like trial-based FAs. If I ever have to do a formal FA, I would probably do a trial-based FA. Okay. Now we have our synthesized FAs. This one is also really cool. I know Dr. Iwata is a big proponent of this one, at least in the video I saw. This is when you're basically going to conduct an interview with either the RBT or a caregiver. You're going to hypothesize the function of the behavior and then just test that condition. Sometimes it's not necessary to test all of the conditions of an FA. Sometimes we have a really good idea of why something's happening. And again, I think this is something that we do a lot more often without formally calling it a synthesized FA, where we might, briefly observe a behavior. We might listen to our RBTs. Maybe we really, really trust them. And they were saying to us, hey, listen, every time I give a demand, the child is eloping out of the chair. So we go into the situation and we're almost positive that the child is eloping because of the demand. We don't necessarily have to go through the alone condition and the play condition and we don't have to go through all that. If we're pretty sure we know what the function is, we can just test just that one function. There should always be, there is always, and I said that a little bit incorrectly, there is always a control condition. So you're always going to use the play condition, the control condition, and then you're going to use it against just that one function of behavior. But we don't have to necessarily test attention if we really don't think it's attention seeking. We don't necessarily have to test tangible. We really don't think it's tangible. So we can just test whatever the condition is that we think that it is. And that's called a synthesized FA. This saves a lot of time. This one, again, it solves the time constraint issue. This actually probably saves more time than the brief FA. All right, and then we're going to go into ones that we're going to be using with behaviors that are dangerous. So this is going to try to solve the risk of creating dangerous situations. I do have a question in the chat. Let me see. So someone asking, when do you provide reinforcement? So it depends upon what phase you're in. So if you're in the attention phase where you're testing for attention, you provide reinforcement for any attention-seeking behaviors. If you're in the escape phase where you're providing attention for escape, you're going to provide attention only for escape. So you're going to be reinforcing the function of whatever behavior that you're in for that condition for. So you're basically reinforcing any maladaptive behavior in the condition you're testing for that specific function. Does that make sense? Perfect. Yeah, my pleasure. All right, so we have our latency-based FAs. This is the first one to try to really solve the problem of a dangerous behavior. And this is where you're not going to, in latency-based behaviors, you're typically not going to repeat it multiple times, because this is where you're going to be using this for behaviors that are dangerous. So this is the idea is that if you have the latency of a behavior, which is basically from when the SD happens, whatever would be triggering that behavior, until the onset of the behavior, that the more severe a behavior, or the more likely a behavior is maintained by a function, the shorter the latency. So if I were to say a behavior is escape maintained, if I put a demand on a child and the child like within 5 seconds starts having a tantrum, or if I give a child a demand and then they do work for 10 minutes and then starts having a tantrum, right? I can say, I'm fairly certain that the child who tantrumed 5 seconds after the demand, it's much more likely that that behavior was maintained by escape than the child who did work for 10 minutes and then had a tantrum. So this is where you're basically looking for a correlation between a latency and the function of the behavior. And again, you want to basically stop the trial as soon as they engage in the behavior, because this is where you really do not want to reinforce those behaviors. So if like a child starts banging their head, the second that happens, you stop. And then you just record how long it took for that to happen. And you're going to be doing all the different conditions. Eventually, if you leave a child by themselves without any attention, everyone at some point is going to come ask for attention, right? But if it happens within 1 minute, then it's going to be a very different result than if it happens within an hour, right? If a child doesn't go to find you until an hour, then chances are they were not engaging in attention maintained behavior. Does that one make sense? That one was a weird one for me. I had never heard of that one before, but that's what it is. And again, I think that's a really cool one. All right, the last one is the analysis of precursors. This is the idea that severe behaviors, such as like headbanging or aggression, generally kids don't start with those behaviors. If you tell a child, and we all know this, right, that like our kids will generally engage in some sort of vocal protest first. So the idea is that there are behaviors that kids will do before they escalate to that really, really severe behavior. And the thing is, and the whole idea of analysis of precursors is that if we're trying to analyze that severe behavior, such as headbanging, but the child vocally protests first, there's no reason we need to see the headbanging, because the vocal protest will have the same function as the headbanging. The headbanging is just an escalation of the precursor behavior, which is the vocal protest. So the reason they're doing the headbanging is because the vocal protest didn't work. But the vocal protest was the initial behavior or the precursor behavior, and that we only need to analyze those precursors in order to make the behavior, in order to know what the behavior's function is. So we tend to, with analysis of precursors, we do our best to stop the FA before they get to the dangerous behaviors. And we're just looking to see what those precursor behaviors are. And we're making that assumption, and again, usually correctly, but maybe not 100% of the time, that the precursor behaviors have the same function as the more severe and intensive behaviors. So that is your analysis of precursors. This is a really, really good idea for dangerous behaviors, because there's really ethically no reason we need to be reinforcing it. The other thing is that sometimes whereas you run the risk in treatment, obviously in these other ones of eliciting behaviors and reinforcing them, sometimes it actually is better. And this is something that Iowata said, Dr. Iowata said, if you guys don't know who he is, he's one of the people who came up with all of this functional analysis research, is it's almost better to reinforce a less severe behavior, because then the child will realize they don't need to get to that higher intense behavior. So if a behavior is very dangerous, reinforce something less severe. And I've actually have said this to my therapist before, like if for children where we're using functional communication training and they're really struggling to learn how to communicate just because there's so many deficits, they'll engage in vocal protest. And if you don't reinforce the vocal protest, they'll start engaging in headbanging. And I've told the therapist, listen, don't let it get to headbanging. So even if you have to reinforce that vocal protest, that we know this child does not have communication skills right now. So we know this child does not have an alternative to that vocal protest. And it's not like we can't expect him to not communicate at all. So he is actually communicating in the best way he knows how to communicate in that moment. And that's not a great method of communication. Like he just goes, and he starts yelling, and that's not ideal, but it's better than headbanging. So let's just reinforce that for now, at least until we can get the child to be able to have some form of communication that's more appropriate. So that's an interesting kind of sidebar that ties into this, but an interesting little tidbit. When you're a BCBA, know that we were always told, like, just reinforce this and never reinforce this. And sometimes in real life, it doesn't play out that way. But those are your types of functional analyses. I hope you found this helpful. I know